December 23, 1944. A winter sun crept faintly over the snowbound hills of Pennsylvania. The war in Europe still raged, but here, 3,000 miles from the front, the echoes of battle arrived in chains. On this morning, 23 German prisoners of war shuffled from the back of a flatbed truck onto frozen earth, boots crunching against ice, their breaths white in the air. Their guards were armed, young Americans wrapped in heavy wool, but their weapons stayed at their sides. The real weapon was silence, the heavy silence of farmland that had not seen such men before. One of the prisoners, Obergefreiter Karl Weiss, tilted his head. He had expected jeers, expected to be paraded like animals through hostile towns. Instead, what he heard was strange. Not the crack of rifles, not the curses of victors. It was softer, the creak of a farmhouse door, the scrape of a wooden chair being pulled, the rhythmic thud of dough being kneaded on a counter. He thought it was in his head at first, the sounds of his mother's kitchen outside Hamburg. But then the scent reached him, carried on the cold air. Apples, sugar, butter hissing on iron. His pulse quickened. For months he had known only moldy bread and bitter coffee in tin cups, the endless march of hunger. The smell was a trick of memory, he told himself, a ghost of home conjured by weakness. But when the guards marched them past the barn toward the field kitchen, Karl's eyes caught something impossible. A woman, not in uniform, not with steel in her hands, but with flour dust on her apron, pulling steaming pies from an oven. The prisoners froze. Even the guards blinked as though they too couldn't believe what they were seeing. The woman's face was stern, lined by winters harsher than this one, yet her eyes didn't carry the hate Karl had braced for. She spoke only once, her voice steady. "Sit them down." And so it began. German soldiers who had crossed oceans with rifles, who expected punishment or worse, found themselves seated at long wooden tables while a farmer's wife placed before them slices of pie, golden crusts breaking under the press of forks. The first taste was cautious, trembling. Sweetness flooded mouths starved of anything but bitterness. What unfolded on that farm would defy every expectation, not of battle, but of mercy. For in that cold Pennsylvania winter, the war's fury collided with something neither side had prepared for. And Karl Weiss realized with a jolt that the sound he had mistaken for rainfall on metal was not gunfire at all, not the judgment he feared. It was the quiet clink of plates being set before enemies, the sound of hospitality cutting through the mathematics of war. The war was still raging, but here, for a moment, the front had shifted into a kitchen. The steam rose in faint tendrils above the plates, curling in the chill air of the farmhouse yard. The German prisoners stared at the slices as though they were grenades with pins already pulled. Some didn't dare touch them, their hands stiff in their laps. Others glanced at the guards, waiting for the barked order that would reveal this was some trick, some humiliation. But the guards said nothing. They leaned against fence posts, rifles slung casual, their breath puffing like small smoke signals. They were boys, not much older than the prisoners, watching with the same incredulity. Karl Weiss felt his stomach knot. He wanted to reach for the fork. He wanted it with a desperation he hadn't known since boyhood hunger after ration cards were cut in Hamburg. But he was certain that if he touched the food, something would happen, a blow from a rifle butt, laughter at his weakness, the confirmation that he was nothing more than a captured animal. Then the farmer's wife, her name, he would later learn, was Margaret Whittaker, folded her flour-streaked hands across her apron. Her voice carried no warmth, but neither did it carry contempt. "Eat," she said simply. One of the prisoners, a thin mechanic named Dieter, broke first. He lifted his fork, hesitated only a moment, and then pressed through the golden crust. The sound of it breaking seemed impossibly loud in the frozen stillness. The bite entered his mouth. His jaw moved once, twice, and his eyes fluttered closed. He swallowed as though he were drinking sunlight. Then another bite and another, faster now, almost frantic, as if he believed it might vanish from his plate at any second. The others followed. Caution eroded beneath the tidal pull of hunger and memory. Within minutes, 23 Germans who had expected punishment sat hunched over their plates, eating pie baked by a woman whose sons might well be across the ocean with rifles aimed at their comrades. Carl's fork trembled as he lifted his first bite. The apples were warm, tart softened by sugar, the crust flaky, butter-rich. For a moment the mud, the barbed wire, the stink of burned diesel on frozen fields, it all dissolved. He was back at his mother's table in Hamburg, a boy of 12, the war still a whisper in newspapers. He didn't realize he had tears running down his cheek until they cooled against the winter air. Margaret didn't watch them eat. She returned to her oven, already sliding another pie onto the wooden counter, her movements practiced, mechanical, as though she were repairing something broken and fragile. The guards began speaking quietly among themselves. One of them, Corporal James Donnelly, muttered to his friend, "My ma used to bake like that, before she passed." He glanced at the prisoners, at their hollow faces softening under the weight of something sweeter than pity. "Never thought I'd see Krauts crying into pie." The other soldier didn't laugh. He only said, "Neither did I." Carl listened to the words, his English still clumsy but enough to understand. He had been told Americans were brutes, cowards shielded by machines, incapable of honor. And yet here he sat, on enemy soil, tasting mercy disguised as apples and sugar. But mercy has weight, too heavy for men who expected only chains. Later, when the tables were cleared and the tin plates stacked, Margaret stepped outside again. She looked at them, her eyes hard but not cruel. "You work in the morning," she said flatly. "Barn needs mending, fences too. You'll earn what you eat." The prisoners nodded, relief and confusion mingling. This was no kindness without condition. It was structure, a strange barter of labor for humanity. That night, inside the drafty wooden barracks built on the edge of the farm, Carl lay awake listening to the others whisper. Some spoke of escape, not with conviction, but with the rote repetition of duty. Others wondered aloud if such food would be given again. And Carl, he stared at the rafters until the blackness blurred into gray. The sweetness still lingered on his tongue. It unsettled him more than hunger ever had, because hunger was simple. Hunger told you who your enemy was. Hunger was survival. But sweetness asked questions he had no answers for. By morning their hands would be raw with labor, their backs bent beneath hay bales and timber. The war would not pause for pie, nor would suspicion vanish overnight. Yet the first crack had formed. In that Pennsylvania winter, the thunder of artillery across the ocean gave way, in one small pocket of earth, to the clink of tin forks and the smell of apples pulled from an oven. Carl knew the war was not over, but he could not shake the thought that, in some strange way, it had shifted. The frost was still clinging to the grass when Carl's boots hit the ground outside the barracks. The guards had woken them before dawn, barking in clipped English that the prisoners were to form up in the yard. The air smelled of wood smoke drifting from the farmhouse chimney, and somewhere beyond the rise of the field, a rooster crowed. The Germans lined up silently, 23 shadows in threadbare coats, their breath rising in ragged white plumes. Carl shifted on his feet, the chill biting through his socks. He thought again of the pie the night before, the shock of its sweetness, the way it had melted the hardness in men's faces for a moment. But now the sweetness felt distant, fragile, like something stolen from a dream. Corporal Donnelly walked down the line, his rifle hanging from his shoulder more like a tool than a weapon. "You'll be working today," he said, his accent broad and easy. "Barn roof needs patching, fence posts too. You'll do what you're told. You'll get fed." He looked at them one by one as though measuring what sort of men they were. When his gaze reached Carl, it lingered for a heartbeat too long. Carl dropped his eyes. The work began in silence. The barn was old, weathered by years of storms, and the roof sagged where beams had rotted through. The prisoners carried planks from a pile, their breath misting with each step. A ladder creaked as two men climbed, hammers ringing against nails. Down in the pasture, others dug post holes in the frozen ground, swinging iron spades like picks at stone. Carl found himself paired with Dieter, the mechanic who had broken first at the pie the night before. They worked the fence line together, their hands stiff on the tools. At one point, Dieter leaned close and whispered in German, "Better than the mud, eh?" His mouth twisted in something that might have been a smile. Carl didn't answer. He didn't know if it was better. It was different, and different was dangerous. Hours passed. The rhythm of work settled into their bodies, the ache in shoulders and backs grounding them more than chains ever could. The guards watched, but not with cruelty. One even offered water when the sun rose high enough to thaw the frost. By noon, Margaret appeared again. She carried baskets filled with bread, jars of preserved peaches, and a pot of coffee so strong the steam seemed to carry the scent for miles. The prisoners froze at first, staring as though she carried live ammunition, but the guards waved them forward. The bread was coarse, the peaches sweet, the coffee bitter and dark. Carl drank it and felt warmth spread through him in a way he hadn't known since before captivity. Across the yard, he saw Dieter lick the inside of his jar, shame forgotten in hunger. Margaret said nothing. She stood with her arms folded, watching them like a woman inspecting strangers who had wandered into her kitchen uninvited. Her face gave nothing away. But Carl noticed the faint tremor in her hands when she lifted the basket again, and he wondered what it cost her to feed the men who wore the enemy's uniform. After the meal, they returned to work. The afternoon sun melted the frost into mud, and the prisoners' boots sank with every step. By dusk, the barn roof was patched, the fence posts planted. Their muscles screamed, but it was the honest pain of labor, not the gnawing despair of idleness behind wire. That night, when they filed back into the barracks, there was a different kind of whispering, not of escape or punishment, but of bread, peaches, and coffee. Men who had spent months thinking only of survival now spoke in low tones of home, of farms and families across the ocean. Carl lay on his bunk, staring at the rafters. The pie had unsettled him, but this unsettled him more. Work, food, warmth, they were threads that tied him to something human, threads that could strangle a man with longing if he wasn't careful. The war was still raging in Europe. Cities burned. Men he had trained beside were bleeding in the snow of the Ardennes. Yet here, in the quiet of a Pennsylvania farm, he was repairing fences under the eye of a woman who had lost more to the war than he could guess. Days turned into weeks. The rhythm held. Work at dawn, labor through the day, meals at noon and night. The prisoners began to move with less hesitation, their bodies remembering strength. The guards began to watch less closely, leaning on fence rails as the Germans hauled timber and split logs. Margaret kept her distance, though she fed them daily. And then one morning, something shifted. Snow had fallen overnight, thick and heavy, bending the fence posts they had set weeks before. The prisoners were sent out to clear it, shovels in hand. Carl worked until sweat prickled beneath his coat despite the cold. When he paused to catch his breath, he looked up and saw Margaret watching from the porch. Their eyes met, just for a moment. Her expression didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. It was something else, something searching, unsettled. Carl dropped his gaze quickly, but the look stayed with him all day. That night, lying awake, he realized what it was. She had seen him not as a prisoner, not as a German, but as a man moving snow from a path. For a flicker of a second, the war between them had gone silent. And that silence was more dangerous than any gun. Because it meant the walls were thinner than they seemed. Because it meant that, in the middle of war, something unexpected was taking root. Something neither side was prepared for. The snow lingered on the fields for weeks, turning the Pennsylvania landscape into a patchwork of white ridges and dark lines of bare trees. For the prisoners, the world had shrunk to the rhythm of shovels scraping paths, of hammers striking nails in the brittle cold, of breath fogging the air in gray puffs that disappeared almost as soon as they formed. Carl had lost track of how many days had passed since the pie. The sweet taste had faded from his mouth, but its echoes still lingered in the way he caught himself watching Margaret from the corner of his eye whenever she came out of the farmhouse. She never smiled, never spoke a word directly to him, but her presence bent the silence of the farm like wind bends a field of wheat. The guards treated the routine as though it were unremarkable. Corporal Donnelly joked with the men as they worked, his Irish-American lilt carrying across the yard. Another, Private Reynolds, smoked constantly, flicking his ash into the snow, his rifle slung so loosely that Carl sometimes wondered if he even remembered it was a weapon. They weren't cruel, but they weren't careless either. The rifles were always there, like an unspoken punctuation to every act of labor and every bite of food. One morning, the prisoners were ordered to split into smaller groups. Carl, Dieter, and two others were sent to the lower pasture, where the fences sagged under the snowdrifts. They carried axes and saws, trudging through snow up to their knees, their hands numb even through gloves. The work was grueling. Each strike of the axe sent vibrations up Carl's arms until his bones ached. Each log he lifted pressed down on him as though the forest itself were trying to crush him back into the earth. He kept his head down, working steadily, until he noticed Margaret approaching. She wore a heavy wool coat, her boots crunching in the snow. In her hands she carried a basket covered with a red cloth. She didn't call out, didn't wave, just walked straight to the fence line where the men worked. Carl straightened, his breath ragged in the frozen air, and watched her set the basket down on the fence rail. "Coffee, bread, apples," she said simply. Her voice was firmer than he expected, the kind of voice that didn't ask for permission. The prisoners hesitated. Margaret stood waiting, her eyes sharp. It was Private Reynolds who finally nodded. "Go on, take it. She brought it for you." Carl reached first, pulling back the cloth to reveal a loaf of dark bread, steam still curling from its crust, and a row of apples, red against the snow. He tore a piece of bread and passed it to Dieter before taking a bite himself. The warmth hit him like fire. Margaret didn't move. She watched them eat, her expression unreadable, but her eyes flicked over Carl for just an instant too long. Then she turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, her figure shrinking against the white fields. Dieter chuckled, low and bitter. "Maybe she thinks we're stray dogs, feed us, keep us working." Carl said nothing, chewing slowly. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of her eyes on him. It wasn't pity. It wasn't hate either. It was something in between, something uneasy. That night in the barracks, the men whispered again. Some joked crudely about the farmer's wife, their voices hushed but rough with hunger of another kind. Others speculated about her motives. One suggested it was all a trick, that the bread might be poisoned. Laughter followed, but it was nervous laughter. Carl lay awake, staring into the dark, the wooden rafters above his bunk etched into his mind. He thought of the apple's crisp sweetness, of the bread's heat in his hands. He thought of Margaret's silence, and the way she carried herself like someone who refused to be bent by war, no matter how much it had already taken from her. The next morning brought another shift in the routine. The guards gathered the men in the yard, explaining in clipped tones that a shipment of supplies was expected at the train station in town. A few of the stronger prisoners would be taken to help unload. Carl was chosen. The truck ride was long and cold, the wooden slats of the vehicle rattling with every bump in the frozen road. He sat shoulder to shoulder with Dieter, the guards opposite them. No one spoke. The landscape rolled by, farmhouses half buried in snow, barns standing silent, smoke rising from chimneys. It was a strange mirror of home, familiar and foreign at once. At the station, American soldiers swarmed around a freight car. Crates were unloaded, marked with stencils Carl couldn't read in the dim light. He and the others were ordered to carry them, the weight bowing their backs, their boots slipping on the icy ground. It was here, amid the grunts of labor and the shouted orders of guards, that Carl caught sight of something he hadn't expected. Another group of prisoners, Russians by the sound of their guttural speech, working under separate guard. Their faces were gaunt, their movements mechanical. they didn't look up. The sight shook Carl. The war was everywhere, reaching into every corner, pulling men from every nation into the same vortex. For a moment, carrying a crate across the frozen ground, he wondered whether any of them were truly enemies, or if they were all just men caught in someone else's storm. When the work was done, the Germans were herded back into the truck. The ride to the farm was quieter than before. Carl sat with his hands folded, staring at the frost that crept along the edges of the wooden slats. That night Margaret served stew, thick, steaming, filled with potatoes and carrots. The men devoured it, their spoons scraping the bowls. Carl ate in silence, but when Margaret collected the empty dishes, her gaze fell on him again. Just a moment, just enough. The following weeks blurred into one another. Work in the fields, meals brought to them, nights spent in the barracks where whispers gave way to snores. Yet under the surface, something subtle was shifting. The prisoners no longer looked only at their captors with suspicion. They began to look at the farm as a place, a rhythm, a kind of life carved out in the shadow of war. And Margaret, she became the silent center of it. Her hands feeding them, her eyes measuring them, her presence softening and hardening in turns. One evening, Carl lingered after the others filed back to the barracks. He stood in the yard, the snow crunching under his boots, staring at the sky where stars burned cold and sharp. Margaret stepped onto the porch. "You work hard," she said, her voice carrying in the still air. Carl turned. He wasn't sure if he should respond. He settled on a single nod. Margaret studied him for a moment, her face unreadable. Then she spoke again, quieter this time. "My husband was killed in France. I never saw his body, just a letter." Carl's chest tightened. He opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he possibly say? Margaret didn't wait for an answer. She turned and went back inside, the door closing softly behind her. Carl stood there long after she had gone, the cold biting at his skin. For the first time since his capture, he felt the full weight of the war press against him. Not just his war, not just Germany's, but hers too. And he realized, with a clarity that unsettled him, that the farm was no longer just a prison. It was a place where grief, survival, and something unspoken lived side by side. A place where the line between enemy and human was starting to blur. And he didn't know whether that would save him or destroy him. The snow gave way to mud as winter began to loosen its grip on Pennsylvania. The prisoners noticed it first in the mornings. The sharp bite of frost on their fingers dulled into damp cold, and the paths they cleared every day no longer crunched beneath their boots but sucked at them, sticky and heavy. The farm shifted with the season. Calves bawled in the barn. Chickens scratched furiously in the thawing earth. Life was pressing forward, indifferent to uniforms, indifferent to borders. For Carl, each day felt heavier than the last. Not because of the work. His body had grown used to the rhythm of labor, but because of the weight of something far less tangible. He could no longer look at Margaret without remembering the words she had spoken that night on the porch. "My husband was killed in France." The sentence played over in his mind like a refrain he couldn't silence. He carried it with him into the fields, into the barn, even into the barracks where the other prisoners' snores could not drown it out. The others didn't know. To them, Margaret was still the farmer's widow who fed them, who kept her distance, who moved with a kind of measured gravity. But Carl had seen beneath the surface just for a moment, and it had unsettled him in ways he didn't dare share. He knew what the others would say. They would mock him, accuse him of weakness, whisper that he had forgotten who he was. But it wasn't that he had forgotten. It was that he remembered too much. One afternoon, as the thaw deepened, Margaret came to the field where the men were repairing a broken section of fence. She carried her ever-present basket, the red cloth covering it as always. When she pulled it back, the smell of warm bread and roasted turnips filled the air. The men crowded closer, eager hands reaching. But Margaret's eyes were on Carl. Not long, not enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough that he felt his stomach twist. She set the basket down, spoke no word and walked back toward the house, her boots sinking into the mud with each step. Dieter elbowed Carl with a grin. "Looks like she's taken a liking to you." Carl scowled and shoved him off. "Shut your mouth." But the words rang hollow, even to himself. That night the barracks buzzed with a different kind of whisper. The men had begun to talk of the war again, not as soldiers but as men wondering when, or if, they would ever go home. Rumors seeped in through the guards, stories of German cities reduced to rubble, of Allied armies pushing deeper, of surrender whispered but not yet spoken aloud. For some, hope rose with these stories. For others, despair. Carl felt neither. He only felt the strange weight of the farm pressing closer around him, as if the fences they built every day were penning him in more tightly than any barbed wire ever could. Weeks later, the turning point came. It was late afternoon. The sky hung low and gray, rain threatening but not yet falling. The prisoners were herding cattle into the barn when shouts broke the monotony. Private Reynolds came running from the road, his rifle clattering against his chest. "Escaped prisoners," he yelled. "From the camp south of here. 3 men. Armed." The air froze. Even the cattle stilled, their ears twitching. The guards snapped into alertness, barking orders. The Germans were corralled together, rifles aimed squarely at them. Carl felt the old fear return, sharp and suffocating. Hours passed. The guards paced nervously, waiting for word. The prisoners sat in silence, the tension so thick it seemed to settle into their lungs. Then headlights appeared on the road. A jeep pulled into the yard and out stepped an American officer, his face hard, his uniform crisp despite the mud. "2 of them were caught," he said flatly. "The third still out there." His eyes swept over the German prisoners. "If any of you are caught aiding him, you'll answer for it, with your lives." The warning hung in the air like a blade. Then the officer left, the jeep roaring back into the night. That evening the guards doubled their watch. The prisoners were herded into the barracks and locked in, but the air inside was restless. The men whispered fiercely, their voices rising and falling. Some cursed the escapees for bringing danger down on them. Others muttered that perhaps escape was still possible. Carl said nothing. He sat on his bunk, staring at the wooden floor. His thoughts were not of escape, not of Germany, but of Margaret. He wondered what she thought of it all, the danger on her doorstep, the rifles in her yard, the constant reminder that the war had not yet ended. The answer came sooner than he expected. 2 nights later, during a steady drizzle, Carl was sent with 2 others to fetch water from the pump near the barn. A guard followed close behind, his rifle slung across his back. The rain plastered Carl's hair to his forehead, trickling down his neck. And then he saw him. A figure crouched in the shadows near the fence. Thin, gaunt, eyes wild. A German uniform, filthy and torn, the SKP. The man's gaze locked onto Carl's. For an instant, neither moved. Then the man raised a finger to his lips, pleading silently. The guard hadn't seen. He was fiddling with his cigarette, shielding it from the rain. The other prisoners didn't notice either, too busy struggling with the heavy buckets. Carl's heart thundered. He knew what the man wanted, a chance, a diversion, a lifeline. But Carl also knew what it meant. The officer's warning echoed in his head. "You'll answer for it, with your lives." The decision had to be made in a heartbeat. Carl turned away. When the buckets were filled and they trudged back, Carl risked one last glance. The shadow by the fence was gone, vanished into the night. He said nothing. The next morning the farm was buzzing. The SKP had been caught just miles away, shot in a skirmish with guards. The news spread fast. Some prisoners looked shaken, others grimly satisfied. Margaret said nothing. She served them bread as she always did, her face a mask. But when she handed Carl his piece, her eyes flicked to his again. And in that glance he wondered, did she know? Had she somehow seen? The days that followed felt heavier than ever. The war was ending, the guards said so openly now. Rumors of surrender grew louder, impossible to ignore. The men whispered of going home, of seeing families, of starting over. But Carl couldn't imagine it, not anymore. His thoughts remained tied to the farm, to the fences, to the woman who fed him in silence. The final Sunday before the war's end, Margaret did something none of them expected. She baked again. Not bread, not stew, pie. The smell carried across the yard as she brought it out, steam curling in the spring air. She set it down before the men without a word. The prisoners froze, their memories snapping back to that first night, to the taste that had shocked them into silence. Carl took the first bite. The sweetness filled his mouth, foreign and familiar all at once. Around him, the others ate hungrily, some closing their eyes as if to hold the moment tighter. Margaret stood watching, her hands folded. Then quietly she said, "The war's ending. You'll be sent home soon." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the weight of it. She turned and walked back to the house, her figure retreating for the last time. Carl chewed slowly, staring after her. The pie was sweet, but it burned in his throat, because he knew, with a clarity sharper than any rifle's shot, that some wars did not end with surrender. Some wars lingered in memory, in silence, in the space between two people who should have been enemies but weren't. And as the farm slipped back into quiet, Carl realized that this place, this woman, this pie, would haunt him longer than any battlefield.